Hi, my name is Craig Porteous. I'm a principal consultant with Advancing Analytics, and I'm going to talk about adventures in CICD with Azure Synapse. I'm going to talk specifically about the workspace deployment component. We'll run through the process, the tools, gotchas for setting up a deployment pipeline using Azure DevOps. So let's start by thinking about how you develop within Azure Synapse and the different scenarios that might come up. The first one is using a single environment. So how does that work with multiple developers, potentially users coming in and using that system while development is taking place? It's quite difficult. You've got a high risk of clashes between developers making changes to code, pipelines, data sets that might be getting used by other people. So there are some risks with that. You've got, as I mentioned, the cross-development conflicts. It's difficult to test, and potentially it's a moving target if users are consuming the data at the same time. So let's think about multiple environments. That's something that's quite commonplace. You have a development environment, a testing environment, and production, and maybe even more than that. But how do you promote your code between those environments? Those changes to notebooks, to SQL scripts, to databases, for example. It's the movement of that code between each of those environments, which is what we want to talk about today. And that's where continuous deployment pipelines come into play. So what is CI/CD? Stands for continuous integration and continuous deployment. And although they fit together, they are individual processes. CI focuses on the testing and, if necessary, compiling of code, whereas CD, continuous deployment, focuses on deploying the code. Overall, they have a similar goal of consistency and automation. So how do we apply that to Azure Synapse? How does that help us? So there are some prerequisites to getting started, to being able to set up the environments in the right way so that we can make use of those continuous deployment pipelines. The first thing is to set up source control with our Azure Synapse environment. And this would primarily just be your development environment. The next thing is to set up all of the environments that you need. So your multiple environments to progress that code through development, test, through to production. And then finally, it's not just a technology solution, it also needs process. So working in that source control process, whether that be feature branching as demonstrated here, where code comes from the main branch into development, developers work on it within a feature branch, and then merge that back in through pull requests into the development branch. Or you use some other methodology. That discipline needs to be there to be able to control what code is getting deployed to each of the environments. So now that we've got the prerequisites defined, how do we deploy that content? And I'll go into a lot more detail on the artifacts in another talk, but I want to concentrate specifically on the resources. So laying that groundwork, laying those foundations for getting your Azure workspaces in place. And this will allow you to automatically deploy changes and updates and even the initial deployment of your development, test, and production environments. So thinking about Azure Synapse, there are two parts to consider, and that's what it breaks down into as demonstrated here. You've got artifacts, which is generally speaking all of the content within your workspace. And then you've got resources, which is the workspace itself and the core components that essentially sit outside it, your Spark pool, the storage layer. You've got the security around that as well. There are some elements that don't actually sit within either of those camps, and those are ones that you need to be aware of. So you've got your Purview connection, SQL dedicated pools as well, and the database objects within them. So thinking about that deployment process, we've got our resources, we've got our artifacts. Both of them primarily use ARM templates. Our resources will use an ARM template that's defined with parameter files to be able to deploy to a new environment. Whereas our artifacts will use an ARM template that's generated by Synapse. So when you update your code, you are able to generate that ARM template to be able to deploy the code to the next environment. But there's a small caveat there that you need to consider. When you're deploying the artifacts using the ARM template, it's not entirely going to work. There are many components that will not be able to be deployed using the ARM template to the target environment. This is where you get quite restricted in terms of the tools that you need to use. To make that deployment of the artifacts to your target environment, you need to use the extension within Azure DevOps that allows Synapse Workspace deployments. As I said, I'm not going to cover that one in this talk. I'll just go through the ARM template deployments. So let's go into a demo and we'll take a look at what that looks like. So I've built everything here in Azure DevOps, and that means we've got the repos and we've also got our pipelines defined in here as well. So starting with the repo, we've got our Azure Resources repo. And within here, it's basically made up of a single JSON ARM template and also the parameters that feed into that ARM template. And we've got a different set of parameters for each environment that I'm going to be deploying to. We've got dev, production, UAT. The other files in here are an original YAML pipeline file for the Azure DevOps pipeline. And we've also got the Synapse pipeline here. And the way I've implemented this is I've actually used a template YAML file, which will feed into the main Synapse pipeline. The way that works is we have the steps defined within this template file. So we've got a single step to do the Azure Workspace deployment, and that's just an Azure Resource Manager template deployment. And that's got some parameters defined that we're going to feed through from the main YAML file. Going into that main YAML file, I've got some variables that are relevant to all of the stages that I'm going to run through. I've got stages for development, for UAT, and for production. And within those stages, I've defined a specialized job within Azure DevOps, which is called a deployment job. And that's what's going to deploy the ARM templates to each of these specific environments based on the variables that are passed through within that stage. It also gives us the flexibility to use environments, which are defined here within Azure DevOps. So I've got a dev, a test, and a prod environment. And clicking into these environments, we can see a full history of deployments, not always been successful as I've been fault finding issues. And we can go up to the top right hand corner and click approvals and checks, which allows us to just set an approval gate within that environment. So when we go through this deployment pipeline, and it's going to go through each individual stage, it will deploy to dev and update the development environment. And once it reaches UAT, it will pause and ask for approval. And that comes out as an email, but we can also set the approval within this pipeline as well. And it does the same for going into the production stage as well. So that is our setup within DevOps, and that's connected to the repo. You can use GitHub as well. That's an option. If I come back to the pipeline, we can take a look at the ARM template and the parameters. So the ARM template can be built from an existing or a new Synapse environment, but there are some tweaks that you need to make to get this to work successfully. One of the things that's key to deploying the resources within your workspace is having the same resources in each workspace. So if you provision a Spark pool, for example, within your development environment, you're not going to be able to deploy those notebooks and anything dependent on a Spark pool to your other environments unless they also contain the same resources. So I've built this into the template using this new parameter is new Spark pool and the Spark pool name, We've got the definition of a basic Spark pool in here, if I can find it. So we've got our Spark pool here. We've got it defined as a small version. You can edit these. You can parameterize these as well if you wish. But for demonstration purposes, I've left it quite basic. And then we define what those parameters are in here. Now again, you do need to make sure the Spark pool names are the same through each environment so that the resources within them will deploy properly. But we've also got these additional parameters that we can set to say whether is this a new Spark pool and is this a new storage account. If these are set to true, it will try and create a new Spark pool and it'll try and create a new storage account. If you're doing an update deployment to an existing environment, then you want to set these to false so that it doesn't try and create new resources. And that's really all the details that you need in here. Some basics around name and the name of the data lake account, the main folder structure in there. You've got your SQL administrator, which you can leave blank for the login password. And you want to set them for each of the environments. So as we make changes to these files, the parameter files, or potentially the ARM template itself, that will trigger the YAML pipeline to fire off. If I come back to the pipeline itself, scroll back up to the top, you can see we've got a trigger on the main branch. If I come down to Visual Studio Code, I can make changes within this repository on any of these files, and that will trigger an update. So if I open up the README, for example, and I just set a new comment at the top, and set a title, just something basic. Save that file, and if I do a git status check, I can see that that change has been picked up. So if I add this and then commit that change, with a dummy comment, I can then push that up to the Git repo. And because I'm working in the main branch here, which is a big no-no, we can now go back to Azure DevOps and look at the pipelines. If I come back to the main pipeline page, we can see this has triggered the Azure Resources pipeline. If I come in here, we can see the 3 distinct stages. If I go into the most recent deployment, we've got the commit comment there. And we've got dev, UAT, and production. And you can click into the details here to see the steps that it's going through. It's checking out that repo. It's then going to do that ARM template deployment. And once that runs through, so you can see it's completed the ARM template deployment, the updates, and it's now paused. Because if I go back, we can see that there is a UAT stage is waiting, and 1 approval is needed for review before that can continue. So I can hit approve, and that will continue through deploying the UAT environment, and then it'll deploy to the production environment. And that's really all there is to the ARM template deployments for the Workspace resources themselves. The real complexity comes into the Workspace components within Azure Synapse, and that's where you have a lot of potential pitfalls and restrictions to work with. So coming back to the presentation, this was really a quick whirlwind tour of working with Azure DevOps and Azure Synapse Analytics and getting those environments in place to be ready to deploy the content within them. As I mentioned, I'm going to be doing another talk where I go into a lot more detail on deploying the individual artifacts internally, and that will be showcased at Data Toboggan on the 12th of June, and it'll be on their YouTube channel afterwards as well if you missed the event. Just to summarize, is this what DevOps looks like in Synapse? It is currently evolving and it's constantly evolving. The actual Azure resource deployment process is fairly straightforward, and you can handle it with other tools such as Terraform, for example. It's where the complexity comes in when you're deploying the actual content within your workspaces, and that's where all the caveats and potential pitfalls come into play. But this dev deployment process is still in its infancy, and the component that I'll cover in the other talk is the DevOps extension. It's currently getting regular updates, although there are some bugs in it at the moment. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you're enjoying Data Scotland's Scottish Summer, and I hope you check out my other talk on adventures in CICD with Azure Synapse. Thanks.